Darrel, are you on? Can you hear us?
I am here. Can you hear me?
We can. Hello.
Howdy, sir. How are you?
Okay. Good to be on tonight.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us.
And welcome back, and thank you so much for coming on to talk to us about your book and the anniversary.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about it because there's been a whole lot going on.
Oh, yeah. So why don't you kick us off here? It's the 10th anniversary. Do I have that right?
Well, yeah, technically this is the 10th anniversary because I published it in 2009. But, 2009 to 2018 means 10 years. But most people will think of next
Math
year.
checks
So
out.
next year is when I'm really pushing the whole idea of the 10th anniversary. But this will be kind of the kickoff for that.
Yeah.
So that's where we're at. And the other key thing is not only is it kickoff for the 10th anniversary of my book, but it's the kickoff for the 10th anniversary of recovering from religion.
Mm-hmm.
Yay!
That's just as important as the book, although the
Yes.
book's the reason now for the whole darn thing to begin with. So
Well, and not to mention that, but just everything that the book predicted, that we're really starting to see come to pass in a lot of ways. So it feels very timely in that way, even though we're talking about, celebrating everything that came out of it and everything that it meant 10 years ago. But now it feels as relevant as ever.
Well, you're right about that, Christy. It's crazy. I look back through the book and I think, shit, everything, it's all come true. I could be Isaiah. I could be an Old Testament prophet here because I don't know how I did this just by looking at the tea leaves and it all worked. So
I think your prophecies are more reliable than those found in the Bible, but that's a whole nother story.
It's a whole thing. If only we had 9 other shows dedicated to that idea.
I have never in my I would never prophesied Trump, but actually I prophesied something like Trump.
Yeah, I don't know who.
He's actually worse than what I prophesied. So yeah.
Well, that being said, I mean, before we get into some of the particulars of those predictions and how you came to them, I'm really curious how the idea for the God virus came up at all. I mean, I know you talk about in your book, you're very judicious in crediting Dawkins and these others that had kind of presented that idea to an extent, but what was it about that connected with you and that made you want to really dive into making that a big part of your life's work?
Well, people don't ask me that very often, Christy, so it's a good question. I can go all the way back. I could go way back, but I'm not. I'm just going to go partially way back in the Wayback Machine to when I'm in seminary. I am at Scarrett College for Christian Workers, and it was a very liberal seminary, and I was taking all sorts of social psychology and anthropology courses. And I came across this notion I had never heard about. Your listeners may not either, even though they're a victim of it every day, this notion of the civil religion. So I started doing research, and I wrote a paper, and I was the only person that semester that got an A under this particular professor. He was known for being really hard-ass, and you almost never got A's from him. But my paper got an A, and it was on the civil religion. And he was very supportive. He says, you should explore this more. This is a good paper and good ideas in it, and it's actually something I didn't know much about until I read your paper. Well, it's always cool when you teach the professor something.
Right.
And that's kind of what happened. Well, I didn't take his advice immediately because I was trying to finish my master's, and then I was moving on to my doctorate. But that paper stayed in the back of my mind for years until the mid-2000s, and I started thinking about that again. And one day I just sat down and said, I'm going to write an article based on that paper. And I would just publish an article like in an American Atheist magazine or something. And I wrote an article, then I wrote 2 articles, then I wrote 3 articles. And I'm thinking, this isn't an article. And I sent it off to my best friend, who's also a psychologist, and he wrote me immediately back and said, Darrel, I've never read anything like this in my whole life. and keep writing and keep sending it to me. So every time I get a chapter written, I'd send it to him, and he just encouraged me all over the place. Just really encouraging response from him, and he's also the kind of friend that'll tell me I'm full of shit if I am. So I could trust that he was probably being honest with me and not just buttering my ego.
Mm-hmm.
And
I'm sorry to interrupt. For myself, learning about the civil religion was perhaps the most interesting or the most new thing for me as well, reading through it. And so I'm wondering if you can kind of briefly explain that to the viewers. Just what exactly are we talking about when we talk about the civil religion?
Okay. Well, yeah, let me finish my previous thought.
Sure.
Dr. Dan Dana is the person I dedicated the whole book to. That's why his name is in the front, because he was so encouraging to me. He's been a lifelong friend. All right, yeah, so on to the answer your question. So the civil religion can trace its roots back to George Washington and some of the things that were going on. There was a huge debate in the Continental Congress about whether God should be included into the Constitution or not, and other aspects around religion. Well, we had 13 colonies, 12 of which were religious, and they fought and they hung each other. I mean, the Protestant Puritans were hanging Catholics and Quakers in the 16 and 1700s in Massachusetts, and all the constitutions of the various states had various, like if you were a Catholic, you couldn't vote in, I believe it was Virginia. I can't remember. If you were not a Protestant, you couldn't vote in another. So each state had religious requirements, and our founding fathers just said, well, let's not do any of that. But there was a debate, and the debate really never stopped. It's always been there. And through early on, an essay in the 1930s called, on the concept of manifest destiny, that the United States is the New Jerusalem, and we have been given a God-given right to conquer this country and become, the masters of this continent, no matter who else suffers. And those concepts of manifest destiny and supremacy also bled over into the notion that, well, then whites have the right to own slaves, and slavery is a biblical thing, and all this kind of stuff. But I think then you get to the Civil War, and the Civil War was massively influenced by religion. And we get Abraham Lincoln using religious language, even though he was obviously not very religious himself, but he really knew how to talk to the nation, and he used lots of religious language. In fact, some of us say that he was the first high priest of the civil religion. And what I mean by civil religion, and what is meant by this concept goes way back farther than what my research did, is that we have an overlayer of religion in our country that has its own idols, and we worship under this religion, and it's an amorphous religion. It's not quite as solid in its doctrines as, say, a Catholic, or a Jew or a Muslim, but it has some rituals that are. If you don't believe me, try sitting down during the national anthem in a stadium.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a ritual right there.
Or kneeling. Oof.
Yeah. Or kneeling, right? Kneeling or sitting down. I just meant as a person in the stands.
Sure.
If you're a player, it's even worse, obviously.
Yeah.
And then of course we've got the idol of the flag, and how the flag is used, how it's always saluted, how you have to place your hand. And those are all religious rituals. And they're rituals that other countries don't really engage in that much. In fact, somebody was saying, I think it was Christopher Hitchens, once said there's only 2 countries in the world where you're forced to say the Pledge of Allegiance, and one of them is North Korea. And so it's a strong religious overlayer, if you will, of our entire political system. And then when you ask the question, you almost have to espouse your religion in order to get elected to any office in the United States, even though it says clearly in the Constitution there should be no religious test. So there is a religious test, but it's very subtle, and it's an overlay of our political structure. The need to be religiously and demonstrative in your religious allegiances, and you have to believe in some kind of God. I mean, it's the Texas Constitution says you can't hold office in Texas if you don't believe in some kind of God. Right. Now, that meant that you could be Jewish. I guess you could even be Muslim in Texas and still hold office.
You can try.
Now,
yeah,
you can try. Now, of course, that clause in the Texas Constitution is unconstitutional, as is many of these others. But you notice they've not done much to get rid of those constitutional pieces in their state constitutions. So the civil religion comes down to us today, and it resurrected its head, ugly head actually, in Billy Graham after World War II and the fight against communism. We really got a highly sophisticated level of civil religion in the fight against communism because we were God-fearing, quote, we were a Christian nation, quote, and communism was godless. So in order to distinguish ourselves from communism and to weed out all those liberals and all those leftists and all those reds in our government, we started using God talk, and we started making people take oaths of office that said at the end of the oath, so help me God. Mm-hmm. Of course, there's been Supreme Court rulings Supreme Court rulings in the 1950s and early 60s that said the government cannot require you to say, so help me God. Mm-hmm. But what president is going to stand up and say his oath of office and not say, so help me God?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and it's only been in the last few years that that's even been tried in the Senate and the House of Representatives in this government.
The pressure is there.
Pressure is always there.
Yep.
Yeah, you seem to make the argument that it's on the rise, in fact, and that, we've seen not just something that had happened during McCarthyism that's sort of been with us, but that, in fact, the pressure is mounting and has continued to become more of an issue with regards to, presidential candidates having to show up in church or having to ascribe to a particular church and those kinds of things. Do you feel that that's true?
Oh, absolutely. The religious right has taken over the narrative in the nation. And what they have done is they have taken on the civil religion as their own. Mm-hmm. And that means that anybody that doesn't adhere to their particular brand of that civil religion is themselves un-American. So they have no trouble saying, if you don't like it, get out of the United States. Yeah. Or we're going to do whatever we can to keep you from voting, because obviously people who do not subscribe to our version of the civil religion are not patriotic. Mm-hmm. Now, there's another whole concept. Patriotism itself is a key component of the civil religion. And any expression of patriotism is participating in that civil religion. And, of course, these two get conflated when you think about patriotism, because patriotism in the United States is frequently the same thing as nationalism. Mm-hmm. So when we elect a president that says, make America great again, what he's saying is, let's resurrect nationalism and let everybody know we're the top country in the world and we ain't taking shit from anybody else, and we're not going to consult with anybody else, and we're not going to follow the treaties that we've negotiated in the past. We're going to go it alone. And it's actually a religious notion. I know it's hard to believe this, especially with Trump, who's clearly an atheist. I mean, the guy's got no religious,
if he believes in one thing, it's himself. Mm.
He is his own God. There's absolutely no doubt about that. Yeah. And if you then look at the way the elections have been going lately and how often you hear religious, it's almost like at a political rally of a Republican political rally in this case. It doesn't have to be that, but it seems lately. They all end in something that refers to God. They may sing songs that refer to God. I was at a basketball game last year. I was there to watch my favorite basketball team, and I was all prepared for the damn, national anthem. What I wasn't prepared for was we're gonna sing the national anthem. Oh, and please remain standing while we sing "God Bless America." Well, where the hell did that come from? And there's like 15,000 people in this arena, and my buddy and I, we're both atheists, we just stay seated for the whole thing. We got some looks like, man, if I had a gun, I'd shoot you right now. And we're just sitting through "God Bless America." We'd actually stood for the national anthem, but we sat down for "God Bless America," and you'd have thought we were kneeling down on the field or something. It was that bad. So this is patriotism and nationalism are just other words for this civil religion. But I'm suggesting in the book, and in answer to your question, Christy, that we need to think of this as a civil religion. And then what does religion do to us? How does it affect our culture? And how does it try to force us to behave in certain ways and recruit other people to help coerce those of us who don't believe in their kind of interpretation of religion? That's kind of a long answer, unless you had some other nuances that you thought needs to be explained or explored.
Well, definitely you talk about how, the rise of evangelicalism, particularly as a political movement, and how evangelicalism really attached itself more effectively, perhaps, than Catholicism or other Christian movements to the civil religion, and that's been part of their incredible influence, which was a little unprecedented, I think, when you actually wrote the book. Am I characterizing that correctly?
Absolutely. And that goes clear back to about 1978 when Jerry Falwell founded the religious right. Actually went clear back to Billy Graham. Billy Graham was the single most important person in getting "In God We Trust" on our paper money. So he really started this, and he kept pushing for it. And then Jerry Falwell came along, and he picked up the banner and ran with it. So starting about 1978, when Jimmy Carter was president, Jimmy Carter is a good Baptist, but he wasn't following the evangelical line that Jerry Falwell thought he should. So Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, and some others started putting together multiple organizations that would organize evangelicals. And I'm going to tell you, because I'm a little bit older than you guys, I grew up in the 50s. And my grandmother, who was very evangelical and very fundamentalist, was scared to death of crossing that line between government and religion. I don't want the government in my religion, and we don't let religion in our government. And she never talked about which candidate was going to be most religiously appropriate or anything like that. They talk openly that way now. Back then, evangelicals were not politically active. They had a very low voting rate, actually, until Jerry Falwell comes along and says, hey, guys, it's okay to get out there and vote in favor of your policies that follow your religion. And prayer in schools was one of the big ones. Even though it was kind of a non-starter for many people, it was one of the rallying cries around evangelical. They took prayer out of school. Well, they didn't really take it out. They just said you can't put it in there. And at one point in time, everybody kind of agreed with that, because the Catholics didn't want to have to say a Protestant prayer, and
vice versa.
The Protestants didn't want to have to read verses out of the Catholic Bible in public schools. So it seemed like a pretty good way to go until Jerry Falwell comes along. And then they jump on the bandwagon of abortion. So now you've got some rituals and you've got some fundamental beliefs. One, that religion should be practiced in the school system, a certain kind, and abortion is against God's law, which is something evangelicals didn't agree on. In the 1950s and 60s, lots of evangelicals were fine with allowing women to do whatever they wanted with their bodies. That's a fairly new development, but it's a mutation of the God virus. religions mutate just like viruses do, and the civil religion has been mutating to keep up and to control our culture. That's the purpose of a mutation. You got to stay ahead if you're going to survive, and they're really good at mutating. The better they mutate, the more brains they can infect. And as we've seen here, you only have to infect about 30% of the brains and get those brains to go out and vote a certain way, and you can literally control the rest of the country. That's pretty what we're seeing here.
Right. And so I have a question. When it comes to this God virus and how it impacts society in the areas of sex and sexuality, can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, if I can jump in very quickly, I just want to say that was, for me, one of the most interesting parts of your book, is you talk about the effects of shame and how that is sort of an addiction that's created and self-sustaining by religion.
Yeah.
Because we crave approval, and we crave the admiration and affection, and shame is almost the opposite of that.
Yeah, and so religion is sort of self-sustaining in that way by creating the addiction and then supply and demanding it.
Right.
Is that about how you would characterize it?
Yeah, well, I think religion gives you the disease and then tells you it can cure you of the disease.
Yeah.
Which it can't, of course. Yeah, well, when I wrote the book, there were certain chapters that seemed to really get responses from people. And the chapter 5 on sex and religion, sex and the God virus, I think I called it, just seemed to get, I'd get 5 comments on that chapter for every comment that came in on any other chapter.
Yep.
I hear Megan laughing there. It's really, people really identified with what that said. Yeah. In fact, that's what led me to write the next book, Sex and God. That was really that one chapter. I said, boy, people are really interested in that, so I'll write on that next.
But does it surprise anyone?
So the methodology that's going on here is a part of this viral metaphor, and I'd use the viral metaphor throughout the book, not because I think religion is a biological virus. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying it acts like a virus, but it also acts like a parasite. So I could have called the book The God Parasite, but most people don't know that parasites and viruses and germs act remarkably similar in the way they attack the body and take over. But what I wanted to demonstrate is that a virus has to get into your body. I'm talking about a biological virus. Gets into your body. And if any of you have had a cold yet this winter and you found yourself sneezing, you have all sorts of mucus coming out of your sinuses and you're sneezing. Well, that's nothing more than a virus that has taken over your nervous system. Took your nervous system over. It's irritating your nose through your nervous system, and it's getting you to sneeze. And the function of the sneeze is to get that mucus out of your nose and into somebody else's nose. So a tiny little droplet of your sneeze will get on somebody else, and they will get infected with that virus. That's the way biological viruses work. Well, your brain is an idea repository, much like your nose is a repository for rhinoviruses that cause the common cold. Your brain is a repository that ideas can get into. You may have noticed that you get sick. You oftentimes get sick when you're really, really tired, when your immune system is compromised, when you've had a death in the family. You get, whenever you go through a physical trauma, your body can more easily be attacked by the germs and the viruses that are sitting there all the time. I mean, you have viruses and germs in your nose and in your skin that can't get into you because your defenses are up.
Right.
But if you let your defenses down, you can get a cold, and you can get some other communicable disease. Well, religion does the same way. I think religion is a sexually transmitted disease, Megan. And I mean that almost literally, because you get it from your parents. It's transmitted.
And how often do people convert in order to maintain a relationship and, have all of these restrictions around who they can and cannot date because of their religious background?
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much that starts happening around your sexuality when you get infected with religion. And how many times have you heard somebody get Jesus? My father died and I got Jesus. Or I married a woman who was very religious and I got Jesus. And marriage is a traumatic. I mean, it's a difficult thing to get into. You're easily influenced at that point in time. And of course, before you get married, a lot of people are having sex. And if they've been raised that their religion says sex is wrong and you shouldn't have it outside of marriage, then they feel really guilty about having sex before they got married. And they come into the marriage with a great deal of shame and guilt on their part. And we can look at where the purity culture, another expression in some ways of the civil religion, purity culture telling kids in school that you are impure and you pollute your body if you're a female and you have sex before you get married. We're teaching girls lots and lots of shame about their sexuality. Well, when they get married then, they carry that shame right into the marriage.
Oh, yes.
And we psychologists see this all the time. I'm sure, Christy, probably in some of the work you're doing.
No question.
You've seen, it's there.
I'm not a doctor or a therapist, and I see it.
Yeah. Well, that's why we're talking today. And the entire reason for this podcast is we're trying to help people get rid of that shame and guilt.
And educate.
I think you may have been referring to this, Megan, but in the book I talk about a simple concept I had actually never heard of before. I created this myself. I'm a little bit proud of it. And that is the concept of the guilt cycle. Is that what you were referring to? Yeah.
Yeah,
well,
I thought that was really interesting, and it very much encapsulated my experience growing up in the church of, we talk oftentimes about how spirituality is this cup, and as you get older, it doesn't get as easily filled up because it grows, and these different things that tell us that we have to keep going deeper and deeper and deeper into it in order to get the same high, the same effects.
Yeah.
And when you don't get that dopamine rush, when you don't feel high off of the hypnotic aspects of religion and the approval and all of these things, then you feel shame, and that shame forces you to go deeper and deeper. And as you go deeper, you again start to see fewer and fewer returns on that. And so you continue to press on until something breaks. You either sort of give up and take a step back, or give up altogether.
Right. Exactly. And you used a word that I want to explore a little bit, and that's the hypnotic components of it. When I was on book tour, I couldn't believe how many talks I gave on this book, because it really became quite a popular thing to talk about. I put in, you'll appreciate this, Christy. I put one little segment, probably not more than 15 minutes into my talk, to demonstrate hypnotic effects of religion. And that was probably the most popular part of my talk.
Yeah, I don't feel like I truly understood religion until I started studying clinical hypnosis. That was the moment for me where everything started to meaningfully click. And you do describe that really well in your book.
Yeah, and it was kind of fun I'd get a volunteer to come up, and I'd do a hypnotic induction with a volunteer. I mean, they knew what I was going to do, but I showed them, and I contrasted in my demonstration. I'd contrast a clinical approach to hypnosis, immediately followed by a church camp counselor approach to the same issue. And the audience would just sit there, and sometimes their mouth would drop open. Damn, that's what my counselor did to me, and it's the same thing you're showing me happens in a clinical therapist's office. Yep. And sometimes, this is crazy and odd. One point in time, I'd ask the person, and now let your right hand just slowly float up. And a half a dozen people in the audience, their heads would start floating out. But anyway, that was just, it was really obvious when people saw it, how hypnotic, how they're using these hypnotic techniques.
Mm-hmm.
They're hijacking the brain.
They exactly are. And people said, well, ministers don't get trained in hypnosis. And I would tell people, well, not the way you think they
Not
are.
clinically.
But they are getting trained. Billy Graham had a hypnotic style about it, and all people have done is just copy his style.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Billy Sunday had a great hypnotic style, and all Billy Graham did was copy Billy Sunday's hypnotic style.
I remember
now you
about
see all these.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember about 10 years ago, people on the outside were really shocked and appalled by the documentary Jesus Camp.
I remember seeing that one.
I remember watching that and thinking, if this is shocking to people, they would not believe what goes on in the church that I grew up in. But if you hold that documentary up next to any YouTube video of Michael Yapko or any other type of clinical hypnosis, it's nearly identical.
Yep, absolutely is. Right.
And I think the most kind of repulsive thing for me is that it starts so early. I mean, I guess another word for it would be indoctrination. It starts so early at such a young age that you do not have, you don't have the skills to develop any defenses against it.
Right. And that goes into the notion of an immune system.
Mm-hmm.
That we have a physical immune system, but we also have a rational immune system. So you're early on, when your defenses are down, when you don't have an immune system, when you don't know rational critical thinking skills, it's easy for your parents, your grandparents, your community to infect you with a very specific God virus. It might be Baptist or Episcopalian. It might be Jehovah's Witnesses. But you'll notice also during that indoctrination phase that those same religions are telling you that all the other religions are wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And they're giving you the immune systems, the rational immune system to resist Catholicism or resist the Mormons when they knock on your door. Because when the Mormons or the Jehovah's Witnesses come and knock on your door, they're really trying to sneeze on you. They want to give you their God virus, their disease.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So don't shake their hands.
Yeah, that's clearly the problem. It's the handshake. Yeah, with that idea of immune systems, you talk about sort of the rise of fundamentalism and how evangelical fundamentalism has really played off of the rise in Islamic fundamentalism, and how those two are sort of ratcheting each other up and a sort of an immuno-response to one another.
Like a cycle of just back and forth until it just goes up.
And all of that, certainly after 9/11, but before the just generation growing up and coming to age in the Middle East after having survived drone attacks their entire life, after having survived all of the aspects of the military engagements that we've had there. And I'm wondering now, 10 years later, as you look at the news, how do you feel about, I guess, the way that you predicted things were going to go, about how you saw them then and maybe how you would view them now?
Well, they've just gotten worse. I thought it was pretty bad when I was writing the book back in 2008, 2009. But it's worse now. And the fact is we can't see the end yet. Mm-hmm. But you're referring to something I spent a couple chapters writing about, and that is that fundamentalism begets fundamentalism. If you get fundamentalism, those people who are most fundamentalist are the shock troops of the God virus. They're out front pushing and trying to infect more and more. And when they hit another culture or another religion, then the fundamentalists of that other religion are going to fight back. They're just going to let the Christians roll over them. The Muslims are going to fight back. Well, you got to have the Muslim fundamentalist shock troops to do that. And this is not the first time in history we've seen this.
Certainly.
This notion of fundamentalism fighting fundamentalism goes back at least 1,500 years.
Yeah, if
When-
not into prehistory on perhaps smaller scales.
Yeah. Oh, it got pretty big when you look at the Crusades.
Mm-hmm.
Crusades were one fundamentalist group, in that case the Catholics, trying to infect another geographic area, the Middle East. Well, there really wasn't a strong fundamentalist Islam at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Islam was still coming out of its enlightened, if we could say it, kind of semi-enlightened phase where they were contributing to architecture and mathematics, and
Mm-hmm.
Spain was like the center of study and philosophy. There lots of cool things were happening in Islam right about the time that the Crusades happened. Well, you don't just walk in and kill lots of Jews and Muslims without getting some kind of response.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Middle East created its own fundamentalists, some of which were pretty crazy. In fact, the word assassin comes from a group that was kind of a result of the fundamentalist reactions of that particular time. I don't want to get too detailed. That's probably not totally accurate, what I just said, but it's close.
Well, sure. Looking again at modern history and everything that's occurred in the last 10 years, how would you sort of characterize the relationship or just this moment in the God virus evolution? Is there anything that stands out for you, in the wake of the growth of ISIS and everything that we've seen, all the scandals we've seen coming out of the Catholic Church in the last 10 years, and these different aspects of religion mutating and changing? Is there anything maybe
Right.
characteristic that you would use to describe this moment in time?
Well, as with any massive social movement, it exhausts itself. It's like an army that spreads itself too thin.
Mm-hmm.
And once the army spreads itself too thin, it leaves itself open to attack because it can't defend itself. It's like, Germany can't fight a two-sided war
Right.
against countries that are big in it. It's just common sense about war. But it's the same thing in fundamentalists. Fundamentalists overextend themselves. And quite frankly, I think they've overextended themselves. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to go away, and it doesn't mean there's not going to be a lot more battles and a lot more suffering before it happens. My question is, are we going to get out of it without a nuclear war? Are we going to get out of it without, having massive social disruption, which could happen?
Mm-hmm.
Of course, social disruption actually breeds fundamentalism oftentimes, because people always see the answer to social problems as more God, more my God, not your God, but my God,
Right.
of course.
More praying
So-
in schools will prevent mass shootings.
More, yeah.
Thoughts and prayers.
I do want to
don't
hop
know.
in real quick, Darrel, just to say, let our listeners know we have phone lines open. And if you are interested in calling in about the topic we're discussing today or any topic in general, the number to call is 512-686-0279. Sorry, go ahead, Darrel.
Yeah, so I think those are all, you guys are right on target on that. There's so much going on with the fundamentalists. But the fact of this last election, you see finally that there's some pushback.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that the Congress switched hands, the Senate wasn't likely. I never dreamed the Senate could switch. But there was some pushback there too. I mean, we'll see how this all goes.
Well,
But I don't
regardless
think
of
there's
the
any way
current...
around.
Well, I was just to say,
Right.
regardless of the current political climate, I mean, I know that that's definitely a part of it. But do you feel like we, as skeptics, as people who believe in science and human equality, have we gained any ground in the last 10 years? Do you feel like since you published this book, despite some of these sort of dire predictions that you made coming true, from the overall standpoint, do you feel like religion is on the march? Do you feel like it's gaining ground?
I don't think it's on the march. I think it has gained about as much ground as it's probably going to gain, but it might hold that ground. That's, the Crusades were a fundamentalist movement that went over and took over the Holy Land so-called Holy Land for 200 years.
Right.
Despite the ISIS kind of response in the 1200s, they still were able to hold on to that area. So I guess we would be foolish if we let our guard down. We would be foolish if we thought we'd won the war, because we haven't. We haven't even won we've only won a major battle at best. So I think there's a lot yet to happen. I do think what you're seeing in Wisconsin right now, and in Michigan and North Carolina, is while they've still got the power, they're going to try to institutionalize past laws that can't be easily overturned, and that literally happened the last 2 or 3 days in those 3 states. Well, that tells you they don't have too much confidence they're going to get back into power anytime soon. They see the wave coming against them now. So they're changing their tactics, and they're implementing systems and methodologies that are going to prevent the next elected officials, whether that be a legislator or a governor or perhaps the next president, from being able to operationalize different policies. Mm-hmm. So we're seeing that pretty powerfully, almost as we speak, Christy. It's pretty obvious, I think.
So,
not sure I got off topic there.
That's okay. So I have a question. What in the last 10 years since you wrote the book, though, for you has been maybe the biggest stride that you see we've made that you weren't necessarily expecting? Looking for a silver lining. What's some of the positive that you've seen that you weren't able to predict at the time?
Well, I think we have clearly seen progress in LGBTQ rights. Mm. We've seen some clear. I love what we're doing there. I think we got a long ways to go. I am somewhat encouraged by some advances I think we've had in civil rights, and that I think people who didn't even acknowledge that it was much more difficult to be a person of color in our culture than it is. I mean, I see people in Black Lives Matter. I see people recognizing from Black Lives Matter and from the Me Too movement, among other things, for the first time saying, "Wow, okay, I had no idea how privileged I was." Mm. And I think this notion of white privilege, as much as the religious right is pushing back against that, mm-hmm. I think a lot of people are starting to figure out that if we want this to be a good, well-ordered, well-organized, and open kind of culture, we're going to have to get rid of some of the stuff that's been going on literally since the days the first slaves were brought here, mm-hmm. and women couldn't vote, and people of any sexual orientation except straight, cis, hetero were not allowed in any political office. So I think we've seen real gains there. The cool thing is it's kind of under the radar in some ways. I really think, and this will sound kind of crazy, and I know we've gotten way off sex. I'll get back to sex in a minute. But in some ways, we would not have realized or been able to push as far if Hillary Clinton had won. And I was a big supporter of her. I voted for her. I campaigned for her. That's not the issue. The issue is we have seen the worst that this movement has got, the worst that the religious right has, and it terrifies a lot of us. Mm-hmm. We would not have realized. I'm gonna make an observation. Before the Civil War, 20 to 30% of the population of the United States, white population, had no problems with the notion that one person could own another person. Well, those people, quote, lost the Civil War, but they didn't stop believing. There's still people out there that don't have a whole lot of problem with slavery, but they can't say that.
We live in Texas, so yeah, we're aware.
Yeah, okay, you've heard that. And when I drive down the road in southern Missouri and I see Confederate flags, I say that person has no problem with slavery. And so and one of my pet peeves, we have the biggest, I'm a big U.S. history nut. I love U.S. history. Mm. And Aaron Burr was a traitor. The Rosenbergs were traitors. But nobody talks about how Robert E. Lee was a traitor. There's no doubt about it. The man was a traitor. So, but he is not vilified.
My uncle was
glorified.
celebrating his birthday on Facebook today or yesterday.
Oh, fun.
And
Yeah.
I was just baffled, you know, and
Confounded.
it relates to me when you're talking about the civil virus and going back to that very briefly. I don't want to derail everything, but you know, growing up in the 90s, granted I went to a Christian school, but I was very much under the impression that the original intent of the Constitution, that's a phrase that was thrown around a lot, and there's a whole movement around original intent, that all of the founding fathers were firm Christians of one stripe or another, that, you know, to them the idea of not having a religious government was crazy, that they just couldn't agree on which type of Christianity it was. And so it was all understood, it was understated, it didn't need to be explicitly made clear that it was a Christian nation. And that is very much not only the viewpoint of the world that I grew up in, the school I was educated in, even sometimes our YouTube comments. And it was very shocking to me to not only realize that, okay, God's not real. Spoiler alert, sorry if you're watching this show and that's new information for you. But to not only realize that God's not real, but that this was never founded as a Christian nation. And so that kind of reconstructing the narrative that you're describing. When we talk about slavery, it's a very similar thing. Yeah, changing the story to sort of match up with what we want to believe now to further a viewpoint.
Right. And that's what's happening. We see evangelical Christianity reshaping history. And in Texas, you guys are like the poster child for this whole thing with your school board.
Yes,
the debate about how the Civil War was about states' rights and these different things, and how the Confederate flag is really just about Southern pride and all of that.
Oh, the Constitution, Mosaic Law being the basis for the Constitution, which is
right.
Which is, whether it's right or wrong, it's not factually true. You know, when we take the morality out of it, it's still a false, inaccurate historical statement.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah, because the Civil War was about states' rights to expand slavery.
Right.
That's what it was about. They don't say the second part. They just say the first part. And states should have the right to expand slavery into the West, into New Mexico, Arizona, California, wherever they want to, West. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act was actually a violation of the Missouri Compromise. I live next to Missouri. I live in Kansas.
Yes,
I know all this
you've
shit.
been there. Yeah, so Darrel, I definitely want to get to the callers that we have calling in, and I'd like to remind everybody that we do still have a couple of lines open. People are jumping on those lines, and as we're picking out that first caller, I just had one last question real quickly. Looking forward for the next 10 years, do you have any big guesses, any thoughts about, you know, you said it doesn't necessarily seem like we've lost a lot of ground and things seem to be turning. What briefly would you say to expect moving forward in terms of, I guess, the battle of belief and the expansion or regression of the God virus?
The God virus is the whole notion I emphasize in the book over and over again is how it mutates. It changes. Just like every year you have to get a different flu shot because the flu virus mutates. If it doesn't mutate, it goes extinct. Well, the God virus has got to mutate too. And what we're going to see is mutations. And we're going to see a lot of mutations, experiments. A mutation, think of a mutation as an experiment. And for every 100 experiments you have, only one may actually work. So there's going to be 100 mutations of the evangelical God virus until it finds one that it can squeeze through the cracks. That's what abortion was. It was one that could squeeze through the cracks. That's what prayer in school was.
Oh, I thought that was just a fun Saturday night. I'm sorry.
Prayer in school on a Saturday?
Oh, sorry. No, I have completely different plans. Never mind.
Okay, I knew you'd find some way to work that in.
Oh, my dad, if he's watching, is so upset right now.
So the fact is, you cannot let your guard down. We cannot let our guards down. If we value religious freedom and freedom from religion, if we value human rights, if we value LGBTQ rights, we have to be fighting, and that's the problem of. I really think the problem of the left of any kind, whether you call yourself liberal or left or progressive, I don't care, is we don't vote in the off-year elections. This is the first time that we voted in the off-year elections in significant numbers that we're able to overcome the religious right. The religious right figured it out. Jerry Falwell says if we just vote in the off-year elections, we can take over this country, and we have the evidence sitting in the White House. The cool thing is the template was that he used, we can use too. He said, run people for school board, run people for dog catcher, run people for everything you can put them in office for, so they get experience and then they move up the ladder. How many of those Tea Party Republicans that are sitting in Congress right now voting against women's rights started in a school board 20 years ago at the behest of Jerry Falwell? Well, that's what we need to do, and that's why I was so thrilled to see so many women and so many minorities not only running, but finally winning in an off-year election, when you almost never see that kind of thing in an off-year election. So what I hope to see in the future is that we mutate and we start changing our pattern, just like religion's constantly changing, and we can do it. We saw it happen in the off-year elections. And another thing we can do, and I think this is the whole reason we're talking tonight, is I think we can blow away the religious domination of sexuality in the United States. And we can do that in a very simple way. And that's with the notion of secular sexuality. And that means that I am a secular sexual, and I am way open about it. Just like I'm open about being an atheist, I'm open about being a secular sexual. I am open about being polyamorous. I'm open about the fact that I masturbate. Other people don't like me saying that out loud, but I'm not going to stop letting people know I'm a human being and I act like one. I'm not a Christian. Well, that's a challenge. That's a direct challenge to the evangelical narrative.
Yeah.
And when my kids or my grandkids or other people hear this, and they hear they're getting taught this abstinence-only purity culture bullshit, they're going to have another challenging narrative there. And I think that's what we need to do, is challenge that narrative at every opportunity.
Right.
Put away our shame and be ourselves. Let people know that it's an option.
Yep. If you're ashamed, then you're still full of religion. Sexual shame is a religious idea.
Yes.
I don't have to have shame to know I shouldn't go rape anybody. I don't have to have shame in order to know that I shouldn't walk around naked in the middle of downtown Kansas City, Missouri. That doesn't require shame. It just requires common sense and following the rules of the culture.
I think
add shame and guilt. It's religious.
Yeah, I think that the religious shame has kind of definitely found its way into the culture, which is a whole nother conversation.